Greetings and welcome back to the Old Ways Rising Farm YouTube channel, where we have just returned from a really long road trip from the East Coast all the way out to the Pacific Ocean in Oregon on the West Coast. So along the way we collected some really nice materials that we're going to use in some future projects and some really cool footage that we're going to use in some future videos, and this video is the first of those. So on our return trip, starting with the oak savannas in the Willimonte Valley of Oregon, and then going through the Rocky Mountains and all the way back into Pennsylvania, we've done a little video log project where we've visited a large number of savannas and open forest ecosystems, took footage within them, and we're compiling it here all together to help you have a sense of what these structures look like and what plants are in them. Now, why are these so interesting? Well, open systems have a lot of structural diversity, which allows for two things. One is highly efficient use of sunlight, and the second is a lot of diversity in structure allows a lot of diversity in plant community. Okay? So you can have a lot of stuff in them. And these are really interesting systems to look to for models. When we're designing agroecosystems, when we're designing agroforestry, when we're designing forest gardens, it's really nice to have a model of what a really highly efficient and diverse natural system looks like. So that's why I put together this montage of all of these systems to help you have a sense of what they look like. Now, these are not the only systems that fit this criteria, and we'll talk about it. We'll mention a few others along the way, and I want to do videos like this on other things. I want to look at edge effect in another video, and I want to look at old growth forest structures in another video. But those will be future videos. Here we're looking at savannas and dry open forests. So the other reason to do this, beyond just getting like a sense of what these structures look like, is in the permaculture community, a lot of people like to talk about designing guilds. Now, a guild is a group of plants or animals that live really well together, i.e. they're good companion plants, they're cooperative, they can occupy the same space without, competing each other out of existence. And they will also thrive in similar environments. And understanding guilds is a very good thing, a very important thing. But I think we need to look at this from a slightly different angle. Guilds aren't something that we design. Guilds are something that already exist. So we're not so much designing a guild to put on our farm. We're understanding a guild that's already out there and then selecting pieces of it to import to our farm. But in order to understand that, you have to see it. So here we're looking at savanna and open forest guilds. And as I go through, I talk a lot about the understory plants that are in there. It's not an exhaustive list of the plants that exist in these habitats. They're too diverse, there's too many of them out there, and you'll want to go and study your local ones anyway once you've watched this video and had some thoughts and ideas. But by talking about what I see growing and what's there, I hope that will start this process of recognizing that these exist, that they're wonderful, fascinating, beautiful environments to study, and that the plant communities within them contain many, many, many useful species that we can import to our farm. Whether that's building a pasture for sheep or cattle and including some tree component within it, or reforesting an old field and developing it into a diverse orchard or food forest. So either way you're taking that, I hope that there's some ideas. And this is indeed an idea generating video more than it is a prescriptive video or a tutorial. So I hope that you'll come along. The first thing we're going to do is made a couple of very simple models to illustrate how surface area leads to increased light capture, because that's a very important concept that you need to have in your toolbox before it makes any sense why we're looking at these environments. And then we start in Oregon and we work our way east. I hope that you enjoy. To understand why these partially opened, partially wooded environments are so fascinating and so useful as models for various forms of sustainable agriculture and permaculture, you have to understand that while we call fertilizer, in air quotes, plant food, it's not really plant food. If we think about food as a source of calories, it's not plant food. Plants gain their calories by combining carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight through the process of photosynthesis to make sugars. Now, carbon dioxide, the three ingredients therein. Carbon dioxide we can treat as basically unlimited. And we've been able to treat it as basically unlimited for a long time, and it's getting more unlimited thanks to human action and climate change effects. So we don't need to worry about CO2. We do need to worry about water and sunlight, because in any given environment, there's only so much of those two. Water we can only treat as unlimited if we go to aquatic or semi-aquatic ecosystems. Okay, so we're not going to think so much about water today. We're going to think about sunlight. There's a certain day length and a certain area of ground for a certain amount of time of the year. And that is the sun-derived calories that the plant can convert into sugar-bound calories and stores chemical energy in those sugars. So we only have so much day and so much area. But to maximize the amount of sunlight coming in and to capture as much of it as possible, we need to think about surface area. So if we think of this sheet of paper, and this is just a standard American piece of typing paper, 8.5 by 11 inches. And if we think about the surface area of this flat piece, it's 93.5 square inches. Okay, just simple math multiplication. Now, this would represent a very simple monoculture type ecosystem. If we're doing a lawn, or we're doing a field of corn, or we have like a forestry monoculture, I don't care which of those we're looking at, we have 93 square inches of sunlight capturing area in this piece of typing paper. Okay? But let's look at what happens when we add a little bit of structural heterogeneity. So this would represent an open savanna. Okay? So now we have a little bit of folding in our piece of paper. This would represent like a line of trees, like a windrow going through an open grassland. So this windrow I just made by folding a piece of typing paper, so it still has 93.5 square inches of surface area. And it's embedded on the region of this overall piece of paper. Now, in order to do that, I lose some of my grassland equivalent to this little measured 3-inch gap. Okay? So I have 4 inches of grassland, 3 inches taken up by my little forest strip, and then another 4 inches of grassland. So I have to sacrifice some of my grass area in order to grow these trees. But in exchange for sacrificing that grassland, I get this whole extra piece of paper worth of surface area. So instead of just 93.5 square inches that I started with, due to this structural heterogeneity, I now have 161.5 square inches. Not quite double, but a substantial impact. Okay? Beloved, can you hand me the other piece there? If I just move this back. What happens if I do it again? Okay. Well, now I've sacrificed more area, and when I set these up, I'm sacrificing, 4 inches here, 4 inches here, and then I left 3 inches of grassland. And this would represent more of an open forest. So now, instead of the first example here, being grass dominated with a little bit of trees. Now I'm representing something which is tree dominated with a little bit of grass still growing inside. Okay? And if you do the math on this, 3 inches by 8.5 inches, I only have 25.5 inches remaining of my original 93.5 inches of grassland. But now I have 2 full pieces of typing paper folded up in here. So I get 93.5 inches here, 93.5 inches here, plus I still have my little grass strips, 25.5 inches, square inches left. So now I have more than doubled the original surface area for light capture. But this is not a process that can go on forever. There are limits. So let's say we have, let's change our model here. Let me get these out of the way a little further. There we go. Change our model up again. And now we're representing a fully closed canopy of something. This could represent a closed forest. This could also represent a closed canopy shrubland or chaparral environment, or a species diverse tall grass prairie. The key to this model being useful is understanding that it is in fact species diverse. And I tried to show that here by having different widths and heights and structural elements to this. And then I took a flexible tape and very carefully folded it over the top. And if I go up around here, around all of those curves, instead of being 11 inches of our starting surface, this is now 19 inches of folded surface. Okay? So when we do the math on that, 19 inches of folded surface versus 8.5 inches of width, we get 161.5 inches. So this model in its surface area is almost identical to this model in its surface area. Okay? So just in having species diversity within a closed ecosystem system, we gain the same advantage as we gained to planting a tree row through the middle of our grassland. And now if we want to do that again and think about this as a closed canopy that has matured, has had some tree mortality, and has entered the old growth phase. I represented that just by taking this tree down, metaphorically speaking, with the scissors, right? Cut out some paper. And then drape the tape over this again, but now going all the way down, coming up and over. Okay? And that now has 229 square inches, okay, and a full 27 inches of folded width. Okay? So 229 square inches is very similar to this model here, which was 212 square inches. So these are all different ways of developing structural complexity, which increases our ability to capture light and use it toward primary productivity, which is the fixing of water and carbon dioxide into sugar, okay, driven by the energy of sunlight. So as we get more and more folding, more and more structural complexity, we get more and more ability to capture sunlight, utilize the water and nutrients that are available in a given environment better, and produce more plant matter. Okay? Now I'm just talking about producing stuff, right? Producing carbohydrates. What the plants do with that carbohydrates and how that is useful to you on your farm is a different question. Right now we're just looking at structure. Okay? And there's a whole varieties of ways that natural ecosystems do this. And all of the natural ecosystems are worth studying and looking at as potential models. In this video, we're going to look at open dry forests and savanna ecosystems as a potential model. I don't want you to think that these are the only potential models. We can look at closed canopy, diverse closed canopy, and old growth forests as a model. And if your context is a wet rainforest or a rich river bottom, this is a much better model to look at for your agroecosystem than is a savanna or an open dry forest, right? But savannas and open dry forests are habitats that exist in a very wide range of circumstances. You get them in drier conditions, like the trees can still thrive, but it's on the drier edge of where they can thrive. You get this in very cold ecosystems, where the cold and also very windy ecosystems, where the climatic conditions are inhibiting the tree's ability to the forest's ability to close up. Okay, you get these in fire-dominated ecosystems, where fire is inhibiting the tree's ability to regenerate to their maximum capacity and fill and make a closed canopy system. And you get this in environments where you have a lot of herbivore pressure, which obviously are good models for grazing systems. So it's not a universal model, but it is a very useful one. And since we were traveling from Oregon to Pennsylvania, we took that opportunity to view as many of these as we could along the way and do a little video blog of a diversity of these in different habitats with different tree species. So I hope this helps. This is intended to be sort of a idea generating exercise more than a prescriptive, here, do this tutorial type exercise. But let's dive into it, show you a bunch of different habitats, and I hope it helps you think some thoughts. We are standing here at the edge of the Willamonte Valley where it comes in contact with the coastal range. And at a certain elevation along this landform, there's an expanse of oak savanna. And this is a beautiful restored example of it. Now, right here in front of the camera, you see the dominant oaks, which is supposed to be the dominant species in this habitat. And then right over here, you can see a planted Doug fir. They shouldn't be here. Ponderosa pine should be here, and that's why this is requiring restoration. The oak savannas historically occupied a large area of the West Coast, as well as the boundary between the eastern forest and the Great Plains. Right, there's a strip of land there dominated historically by oak savannas. Sadly, most of this habitat in the United States has been destroyed, either to create room for agriculture or by invasive species, example being the Doug fir, which are replacing the ponderosa pine that should be in this habitat. Other trees that are common in this habitat are madrone and western black walnut. So this habitat provides quite a bit of food. A little bit of a nuisance that's native to this is the nice patch of poison oak, which you see right there, which I was pointing to with my finger a second ago. So yeah, don't walk in that. But the rest of it is really wonderful plants. Now, this is a good example of a savanna architecture. You have large clumps of trees, which are providing shade and shaded microsites for plants that need that. You also have large expanses of grassy terrain around it. So it's a great compromise between a grassy habitat and a forested habitat. Lots of edge effect, lots of species diversity, lots of patch diversity, and greatly useful to both wildlife and humans because of the large number of food species which grow in these sorts of environments. Now, I'm going to pick the camera up, leave it in about the same physical location, but now we're pointed to the other side of the hill, and you can see even more these large patches of grassy habitat that lie in between the oak trees. Kind of panning around there a little bit. Now, this is somewhat manipulated because it's a restored site, but these oaks are fairly slow growing, and you just have to imagine that these Doug firs, right here's another one in the view, would be replaced by the native, would be replaced by the ponderosa pines that are supposed to be here and much more appropriate for this habitat. Taking another stop along this trail here in Oregon, so we can see a couple other species that are mixed in with the oaks. See, through here we've got some ash. There's another one of those spruces which shouldn't be here and an oak there. And if I pan over and up a little bit, you can see the edge of the restored section and the problem that this habitat is having. Right there's the canopy of the oaks. Way up there's the canopy of the planted Doug fir. So they're coming in and replacing the oaks, shading them out. causing a great deal of difficulty for the native oaks and the other trees that are supposed to be here. Some other things I've seen while walking around here, there's some hawthorn kicking around. Just around the toe of this hill, I haven't seen any right on this trail, but there's some ocean spray in here. There's blackberries in large quantity, and some of the native Pacific wild crab apples I've seen down around the corner. So let's keep walking. Quick stop at another location a little bit up the hill from where we were before. You can still see there's some of these invasive fir trees, but this is just a great view of savanna architecture. Patches of forest, patches of open grass, and if I swivel the camera just a little bit, you can see there's still some, there's some fir sticking out there, but here, this is all oaks, and this is the core of that patch that we were looking up into from below in the first clip at this location. In addition to oaks galore in this environment, which are so useful, it's redundant to even list their uses. Think about all the other stuff that we've seen here. I didn't see the walnuts myself in this little loop, but I have it on good authority that there's a few in a corner here somewheres. There's some hazelnuts right over to my left. I saw some wild cherry just a little bit back, wild apples. There's hawthorn. There's the berries, which are invasive here but still happy in this environment. There's all of these wonderful food plants. We also have fiber plants. We have the ocean spray, which is a traditional arrow wood, like arrow shaft wood. There's the ash trees with abundant timber value, and the seeds have great value for wildlife. So there's so much going on, and in addition to that, you have all of the grasses and the various medicines which grow in the open habitat, the ability to support a large population of grazing animals underneath this abundant canopy. This is just a marvelous example of a marvelous, rich, rich, rich habitat. Right down below there is the trail where we did the very first clip, and I just wanted to show you kind of the top and the core of this lovely patch of oaks. And as I pan here, I'll say one of the other things that I've noted in this patch is that we're starting to see some western red cedar seedlings come up, and just over that way, you're not going to see it here in view, is a larger western red cedar, which represents the next ecotype uphill from these oak savannas. These savannas need a very specific set of requirements. You have to have a combination of how well drained is the soil, how much precipitation are they getting, and what's the temperature to dictate an open habitat rather than one which is entirely grassland or entirely wooded. And that's why they are so fragile and so susceptible to being invaded when you bring in another species which does a little too good in this habitat and wasn't here originally, doesn't belong in this habitat. It closes in and you lose all of the value. As we travel east through Oregon, now we are on the eastern side of the Cascades in the rain shadow of the tall mountains. And we're in a very, very different forest type, but still one which has a very open architecture. This is a ponderosa pine dominated environment, and the openness of this forest is maintained by the fact that these ponderosas, they can tolerate the dryness of this environment, but not when they're in direct competition with a neighbor. So each tree grows at a spacing such that the roots do not intermingle and the branches do not intermingle. And because they're at that wide spacing, there's a great deal of light which penetrates all the way through the forest, and you get a lot of understory coming up underneath. Now, this is not as species rich an environment as what we were looking at in the oak savanna just a couple hours to the west, but there's manzanitas here, which is a really interesting species, and there's quite a few extremely drought tolerant currants and gooseberries in this habitat. So there's a lot of useful plants that remain. There's a lot of wildlife in these environments, and you get a food source for a lot of different critters, especially because you have this understory. but it's very different and maintained by very different mechanisms from the oak savannas we were looking at earlier. As you drive west through that ponderosa pine forest, it gets thinner, and then eventually the ponderosa pine is replaced with junipers. And as you drive through the juniper forest, it gets thinner and thinner and thinner until you reach the opposite extreme of what we looked at a little bit ago, where you have pretty much a forest, but with an open canopy so that you have a rich understory layer. Here, you look around me, this is sagebrush desert with clumps of forest in it. So it's kind of the opposite extreme. But it's still another example of an open forest architecture. And when I'm done talking, I'm just going to kind of pan around here a little bit so you can kind of see a little bit of the diversity. But I especially wanted to talk about these junipers because the dryland junipers, as well as some of the dryland pines like the pinyons, are in and of themselves a rich food source to consider. The berries on these things are absolutely critical for a lot of the wildlife around here. And if you go back in time, people are collecting and eating these berries in large quantities. A number of the western species of juniper have a low enough bitter content in the berry that they could be ground and used as a sweet flour. Okay, when they're all the way ripe, they get quite sweet. And a lot of the wildlife depend on these berries for a substantial sugar boost, energy boost at critical times of the year. The same is true of the pinyon pines. Those are very, very important for a lot of cultures and a lot of species. So even in very arid regions, you can look to these open, savanna or forest pocket within a larger steppe ecosystem and find some very interesting things to model after. So I'm just going to step on the other side of the camera here. And if we just kind of pan a little... Yeah, go me. If we just kind of pan a little bit from that starting point, you can see the structure of this forest, including some very large mature species, large open patches where you have smaller, younger trees, and then out beyond those, you go back to sagebrush. And yeah, I am standing in a campsite, so there's some artificial pruning on a few of these big, beautiful juniper trees. But I wanted to take this moment and talk about some of these dryland conifers because they absolutely have a place in forest garden design. Here we have yet another example of a very open forest type. This is Pando, the aspen clone that's over 100 acres in size, all one tree. All of these individual stems that you see are suckers growing off of one root system. And that root system is perpetually regenerating new sets of suckers as the old trees die and fall. Now, this is an open growth pattern again. The understory, there's a lot of low-growing junipers in here. There's some mahonias on the ground. There's some sagebrush and related plants around. So there's actually quite a lot of diversity in here. Now, why is this one open? Part of the answer is animal grazing. So there are quite a few suckers, but this area was overgrazed for a long time by cattle, which opened it a little bit more than it would be naturally. Okay. However, the aspen tree, the quaking aspen in particular, is so profoundly intolerant of shade that the petiole of the leaf stem, is flattened. And it's flattened so that it waggles back and forth with just the slightest, tiniest little bit of breeze. Okay? That allows the leaves in the upper canopy to not be perpetually above the leaves in the lower canopy. They maintain this openness because otherwise, if the leaves were fixed in position, the top leaves would shade out and kill the bottom leaves. They need that much sunshine. So part of the nature of this tree is just to foster an open canopy under which a lot of different things can grow all of them fascinating. It's a really nice example of an open forest ecosystem and a well-developed, diverse understory. Everything that you see here in the foreground is Pando. That's the extent of that one tree. That big, big, beautiful, ancient grandfather of a tree. And right up here, all of that haze, that's from a forest fire. We need to do a better job. Having continued our journey a couple of states east, we're in the Colorado Springs area, a little bit northeast of Colorado Springs in the Black Forest, and we have a beautiful view of another patch of ponderosa pine forest. We looked at the ponderosa pines in central Oregon, and we saw an open forest with the tree spacing and canopy density being dictated by the lack of water availability, and the understory being penetrated by the various scrub species of the high desert of eastern Oregon. Here we have the same overstory tree species, the same water constraints dictating the canopy density, and again we have an open understory with other plants, non-forest plants coming in, but this time because we're at the edge of the shortgrass prairies, it's the prairie species that are coming in. So we have the prairie sages, we have the prairie grasses, we have a number of prairie wildflower. I saw some blazing star up there a ways. There's some of the prairie legumes coming in here and there. And the openness of the canopy is allowing this to happen. Now, this ponderosa pine forest in this region is also punctuated by a large number of meadows. So you have relatively dense stands. This is about as dense as you're ever going to find, unless you're in an area that's been burned over and you just have a lot of young ones coming up, with grasses penetrating into the forest, but then you also have these large expanses of fairly frequent open meadows, and that is again creating a savanna-like architecture overall. It's not usually described in the books as an example of savanna, but it's that type of architecture. A mixture of areas that are tree-dominated, grass-dominated, and those interfingering into each other. If I do a little bit of a pan here, you can see a great example of just the patchwork mosaic in this type of forest. Off here to the left, there's very, very dense ponderosa pines. And then down in the valley, at the bottom of this canyon land, where a small intermittent stream runs, you can see there's a completely different habitat of low shrubs, a lot of willows and that sort of stuff, whereas in the canyon land itself, it's pretty barren. Okay, and then if I zoom in to the other side of this, you can see right through there, it opens up into a large meadow. So you have this mixture of environments, a lot of edge effect, and it allows for a lot of diversity of plant life to grow in a relatively confined space. Here we're in another beautiful example of an open architecture western coniferous forest leading out into just the most gorgeous subalpine meadow. Now this is a subalpine spruce dominated forest. We are a bit west of Pikes Peak now, and we're at very high elevation. This is subalpine forest. If you look in the distance, you don't have to go much higher than we currently are in elevation to get into true alpine territory above the tree line. You can see the tree line in my background, okay? Now, most of the subalpine forest is very well watered. You only have to drop 50 or 100 feet in elevation below where I'm standing to be in very, very dense forests that you kind of have to walk around things a little bit. Up here, you can pretty much walk a straight line. So those elevation changes are another factor which influences forest density and forest architecture and generates another form of high elevation, sparse open forest with understory and grasslands mixed with trees. We're going to revisit this idea of high elevation open forests further east as we make our way the rest of the way across the country here. But before we leave the western forest, the western coniferous forest, I want to think a little bit about learning from these coniferous forest structures and applying that to an agricultural landscape that we're designing. The trees around me aren't really food producing. The grasslands behind me are very much food producing for livestock, and this combination of tall forest and low grassland can be a very productive form of agroforestry, okay, for grazing on these grasslands. But we can also work with the coniferous component as well. There are a number of conifers which produce pine nuts. Okay? There's other non-timber forest products that you can get from conifers. That'll be a topic of some other video sometime. But many conifers produce pine nuts. I've mentioned in other locations the pinyon pine. There's quite a few species of pinyon pine. There's at least a half dozen. I don't know off the top of my head exactly how many. But they're focused more southernly and in very dry areas. In this journey, we haven't gotten down into any of the real pinyon pine producing regions. I shouldn't say that. We got to Garden of the Gods, Colorado, where all of these come together, but that's a city park and you're not allowed to film in this way without permit. But the pinyons are very dry. They want it dry. They would not do well up at this elevation with this much moisture. They'd just be outcompeted. However, if you're in a dry location, they are a very good choice to incorporate into the design for a mixed conifer or conifer grassland system that you might be building on your farm. But they need dry. Most of them need warm. There's a couple species that are more cold tolerant, but most of the pinyons also need fairly warm. If you're in fairly warm weather, you can also look at the Italian stone pine, okay, which is the pine nut of the Mediterranean. Okay, if you're in a warm Mediterranean climate, think about incorporating that one. It's also quite a bit taller, so you can work with different tree geometries. If you're in colder and wetter regions, you still have nut pines that you can work with. You can work with the Korean nut pine, and I planted that out and talk about that in one of the videos from the very early days of this channel. I'll make sure there's a link in the end screen. Korean nut pine is a very good choice. Swiss stone pine is a high elevation alpine pine from Central Europe. Okay, and white bark pine from high elevation Pacific Northwest. I didn't get into any white bark pine forests on this journey either. Wish I did. Hopefully we can do more. But you can think about those and think about creative ways to include those in your landscapes. And just with that short list, we're talking about the better part of a dozen species that you can look into, see what each species specific habitat requirements are, and see if it works for you. While we're talking about travel, we've traveled almost 5,000 miles. No, more than 5,000 miles, more than almost 7,000 miles in this little journey. And that does take funds. If you're enjoying this content and would like to support it, we have a Patreon, and we are most grateful for all of the folks who are there and would love to welcome you to join their ranks. Now, we're going to leave the Western Mountains, we're going to leave these conifer forests, and we're going to head further east and look at the eastern version of an oak savanna next. Well, we've moved quite a bit of distance. We're now in the oak savanna habitats of northern Illinois. Now, the eastern oak savanna historically was a broad swath of land starting kind of in the middle of the Great Lakes region and going all the way down, forming a boundary between the tall grass prairie region and the dense forest of the Appalachian foothills. Okay, so this habitat isn't here, and it's not maintained in this open condition just by dryness the way a lot of the other habitats on the west coast are. There's plenty of moisture here to grow a large and fairly dense forest, but it's also dry enough that wildfires were quite frequent before fire suppression,
And it's more the fire regime that maintained the openness of the forest than just the water conditions. This is currently an endangered habitat, both because of clearing for agriculture and because, ironically enough, of fire suppression, eliminating that environmental factor, which was suppressing the thinner bark trees and favoring the oaks and an open understory with a rich and diverse flora beneath the oaks. Now, the architecture here is really hard to show on film because it's basically the same patch network of patches and open space that we saw in the western Oregonian oak savanna, but the scale is so much larger. The trees are more than twice the size as the oaks that we were seeing in Oregon. They're a mixture of several species of red and white oak. And the patches are larger, both in the clumps that are closed and the clumps that are open. So you have to blow the scale up so much more that it's kind of hard to get a representative sample in one camera view. But you can see a clumpy patch here, and it gets a little bit more dense to my left, your right. And you can see the open patch right over here that opens up into that meadow. Okay, so you can see at least the basics. Now, what plants are here? Obviously the oaks, and we've already discussed their high, their extreme usefulness as a food species and as food for wildlife. These are tall enough to be a timber species on top of that. We also have elderberry and sassafras right behind the camera. We have a large number of walnuts all around mixing in with the oaks. So again, we're bringing more food into this mixture. There's quite a few elderberries floating around in this patch. There's elm trees. And elm isn't so much of a food species as more of a fiber species, but the elm bark historically was a very important source of building canoe materials, as well as bark for waterproofing roofs. There's willows growing in here. What am I missing?
Mulberries.
And there's hackberry, an elm relative, which, even though we don't think of hackberry today as a dominant food plant that a lot of people are putting in their orchards, that's a sad, unfortunate fact because their berries are quite good to eat, the hackberry. And it's a very, very robust tree. The challenge isn't getting them to grow big and large in the eastern forest. The challenge is finding a branch low enough that you can collect hackberries from. They tend to put them way up in the top. However, there's management strategies for that if you want to work with and make friends with that particular plant. So I wanted to bring you here, and we actually drove quite a bit out of our way to get to this spot, to show you this different view of oak savanna and how you can have similar concepts applying themselves in very different regions with very different trees and tree heights and sizes and moisture tolerances. Also, it's a really good example of the savanna habitat, including some of the eastern trees that we associate with a much denser eastern forest. Now we're going to go further, keep going east, further into that dense eastern forest, but there's still places where we can find open architectures for a number of reasons. So we're going to leave the savannas behind, the Midwestern and Western savannas behind, and go look at what are called barrens communities, where we have open patches letting light in, and all sorts of interesting understory species inhabit the otherwise very dense eastern woodlands. Before we leave, I just wanted to show one more quick view where you can see there's a ring of large trees around a large opening in the middle. In this case, that particular opening is full of black raspberries. You can see the treetops leaning into the opening in this direction. Actually for all directions, but this is the one where you can see it best in the current camera view. And while they're leaning in, they're not fully closing the canopy, which is what allows so much life to grow at the bottom layers of this forest. We're all the way back in Pennsylvania. We're into eastern Pennsylvania, and we're at the edge of the Allegheny Escarpment. which is the northern reach of, the Appalachian Mountains as they come up along the Blue Ridge Parkway, come up into the central part of the state of Pennsylvania, and then curve to the east. You have the edge of the Allegheny Escarpment, then you have a big old valley, and then you have the Poconos come up. And in the Poconos and at the edge of these mountains, as well as a lot of the eastern slopes and the tops of the Blue Ridge and the Great Smoky Mountains as we go further south down into the Appalachians, you get environments like this. Now, this is a montane environment, and they're really special places. They're created by a lot of the same forces that create the mountain meadows and the Rockies, like we looked at back in Colorado. But the conditions are a lot different, and the reasons are a little different. So we're only at 2,000 to 2,300 feet here in most of these areas in Pennsylvania. But these are at the edge of large rises, large cliffs, large elevation changes, and they're overlooking valleys that are only 600 feet in elevation. So we have an elevation change, of 1,000, 1,500 feet, depending on which specific one you're looking at. And in winter, when the nor'easters come off of the ocean, that wind comes, it hits those bluffs, and swoops over with a tremendous speed and really inhibits the ability of tall forest trees to grow. This gives us these special environments that are called barrens in some books, and heath balds in others, or laurel balds. Further south, they like to call these balds. But we get really interesting plant communities. First, notice that we're back to a savanna type environment, but instead of grasses dominating, the heath family of plants is dominating. So a lot of these are edible or medicinal. Some are just beautiful. Right here we have a mountain laurel. These guys are toxic, but they're beautiful. You can see more around there. But right below me we have a lowbush blueberry, huckleberries. Right? Obvious edible plant, wonderful plant. All of these beautiful blueberries in here. Back behind me is a really low ground cover that you can kind of see in the background of this shot is wintergreen and Allegheny blackberry mixed together. Okay, both the wintergreen is the source of the flavoring wintergreen. It's useful in that way. The Allegheny blackberry is a true blackberry that you can graze and eat on. There's a number of interesting trees around. We've got some red maples behind you. We've got a lot of red pine in here. And the three pines that really like this environment are Table Mountain pine, which is kind of endangered because one of the other forces which shapes these is that they're more fire prone than most of the eastern forest. The Table Mountain pine is serotinous, so if fire suppression is not regenerating. But we still have the red pine, and we still have the Virginia pine in abundance. And now the CCC planted a lot of Scots pines, so that has also come into these communities as a significant component. But we really need to work with and preserve the Table Mountain pine, because that's an Appalachian endemic that we don't see other places. Another rare one, right in this particular habitat, it's hiding in the bushes down there, and it's not in bloom. But sheep laurel, Kalmia angustifolia, is a dwarf form of mountain laurel, only gets this tall. When they're in bloom, they're beautiful, though. So we have a wonderful, rich environment there. Also in the shrub layer, there's some oaks that are either staying low because they're dwarfed by the wind coming over, or the one I'm looking at right here to my left. Around the edges of this patch, there's a lot of white oak and chestnut oak, which are common oaks up in these high elevation dry locations. And often they will be spread out so far that you get an understory of lowbush blueberry and huckleberry growing down with them. But we also get into some really interesting and rare species like this bare oak. This is Quercus obliquifolia, and this is one of two eastern scrub oaks. Okay, they only ever get 15 or 20 feet tall. They grow like a shrub. They grow quickly, and they're pretty quick to produce acorns because they grow so quickly. But they they grow up in these habitats. The other of the eastern scrub oaks, and there aren't any in this particular location, is the dwarf chinkapin oak. This is in the red oak group. The dwarf chinkapin oak is in the white oak group. Okay, so we get some interesting species. We also get, there's a lot of sassafras in here. There's a lot of wild mountain ash in here, which is a wonderful plant for the wildlife. So there's just a tremendous mix of species that you don't see in the closed-in northern hardwoods or southern oak hickory forests proper when you get down out of these balds and into the bottomland. Let's keep walking around and I'll show you some more really interesting plants in this area. It's really hard to get good shots in this habitat just because there's always a bush where you need to put the camera. But right here is the top of a mountain laurel bush. Right, and this is head high. That's about 5-6 feet off the ground right there, and that's as big as they get. And this right behind it is a fully mature bare oak or scrub oak. Okay, and that's a big one. That is a really big tree for this species. It's hard to show perspective in this environment, but I wanted to show you that big example. So here I just brought the camera down for a close-up of some of this low-growing ground cover I was talking about back in the first shot of this location. And these little guys here, this is that wintergreen, and if you pick one of these leaves and crush it up, oh, it just smells like it just smells beautiful. And this little teeny tiny guy is the sheep laurel. Very, very small little plant. Beautiful when they bloom. Hard to see much right now. They are toxic, but they're just a lovely little species to have. They're just great little things. Another lovely plant that produces a wonderful edible berry is this fellow right here. This is a black aronia. If I just pull a couple of the berries so that you can bring them closer, they look a lot like blueberries, but they're actually in the rose family instead of the heath family. So these are fairly closely related to apples and pears. They're a lot more tart, a lot more bitter, a lot more like a black currant, but they're entirely edible, and they're comfortable to eat out of hand. In the springtime, these are just absolutely covered with the most beautiful white flowers, and then here in late summer, they produce the berries, which can be harvested as people food or left for the birds. But it's another wonderful plant that we only really see in the shrub-dominated environments at high elevation. Other places, it's not that they can't exist other places, but they need a refugia like this in order to outcompete the taller forest trees, or they just get shaded out. There's two forms. One is a tall shrub that, will grow on the order of 10 or 15 feet tall max, kind of like the scrub oaks. And the other is a really low dwarfed mat plant. They're fairly malleable and will kind of adapt to whatever light conditions they need to adapt to. But if you want just a low growing mat plant, you want to make friends with this guy in your garden, there is a cultivar called Aronia low scape mound that can be had from plant nurseries and will stay low as a ground cover species. And then if we look over here at this beautiful plant, this is sweet fern. And it's in the same family as the myricas, right, your bayberry and sweet bay. It is beautifully fragrant. Just walking past a clump of this, you get it. And all of the myricas are really interesting because they're one of these plants that fix nitrogen through a completely different mechanism than the bean and peas. Right, so they use, they do associate with bacteria, but it's not rhizobium. It's the actinorhizal bacteria, which is related to the bacteria in your mouth, in dental plaque, actually. But it associates with the roots. They do make root nodules, just like the beans and peas do, and they fix nitrogen and help establish fertility on otherwise low fertility sites. So they're a really wonderful pioneer species. Very, very fragrant, beautiful. Again, if you just want a fragrant garden, these will be fragrant all year, or at least the whole growing season anyway. They have been used some as teas. Most of the species of myricas have, but you want to be a little careful. There's some toxic stuff in there if you overdo it.
So make sure you do your own research and know what you're getting into and know if there's any contraindications for you. The information's out there if you want to look it up. Let's go find some other plants. Now here, we're just on the other side of the hill. This is the lee of the hill rather than the exposed side of the hill. And you can see looking down in from a rise into a dry heath forest. It's open and you have this abundant growth. We're looking at mostly mountain laurel and witch hazel. This guy right there is a witch hazel. But you get in various areas, you'll get a lot of mountain laurel, you'll get a lot of rhododendron, and you'll get a lot of blueberry, depending on which specific corner of the Appalachians you find this habitat in. Usually you'll see this written up as a dry oak heath forest, but here we are in the northern hardwood zone, so oaks aren't as common, so we're looking at a lot of birch and red maple in this view, rather than the white oak and northern red oak that you'll see further south and hickory mixed in. But it's still the same architecture for the same reasons, just a little bit farther north than most of those patches occur.
This is the last site that I want to take you to in this video series, and this is still in the state of Pennsylvania. The state typically associated with these dense, lush, closed, tight, packed forests. But we have here an open, prairie-like habitat, complete with tall grass prairie species like big bluestem. Now, the dominant, plants that you would come here to gather for food are the elderberry right behind me, and most of the shrubs out in the background are blueberries. And there's a lot of these environments in the area where I grew up, and going out and picking blueberries is a big local activity in July. But why are these here? Why is there this opening in what's otherwise a very dense, dark forest? And the answer is that there's patches of territory where either it is artificially water restricted, which is what's happening here, or there's a problem with soil chemistry, which prevents the closing of the forest. This particular site is a glacial moraine. This is an area where during the last ice age, the massive Laurentide ice sheet stopped right here, and then when it melted, it's dropped all of its sand. So the undulations in the terrain behind me are big old sand dunes created by glacial ice. Because of that, even though we're a summer wet climate, the soil is excessively dry because it's sand dunes, okay? And because of that, you don't have it closing up quickly. Now, over time, I don't know exactly what the use history was of this particular site. They will often partially close into something like a dry oak heath forest like we were talking about earlier at the edge of the Allegheny Escarpment. But they're not going to fully close, and they'll always have at least a savanna-like environment. Now, these as a broad category are called barrens. So if you want to research these and research what sort of open habitats might be near you, research barrens. And they take a couple of common forms. The glacial dune barrens is one type. You also have shale barrens, where you have a super steep slope with exposed crumbling shale that just prevents large amounts of permanent soil formation, and we'll get a barrens community. Limestone alvars are limestone outcrops that are both water restricted, and because there's so much lime, the soil chemistry inhibits tree growth. And then serpentine barrens are another form. So serpentine often has a lot of heavy metals with it that trees don't like. Okay, so along the Pennsylvania-Maryland border, also there's some up in New England, and there's a number out in the West Coast. I didn't get to any when we were out in Oregon, but there's a number of serpentine barrens out in, Washington, Oregon, California, down along that swathe. And there's a really, really good comprehensive book on all of these types of barrens that I will put a citation to down in the description box. It's not the easiest to find, and it's fairly expensive when you do, But if you take that citation to your local library, they can probably get it for you by interlibrary loan, and you can read it and look through it. And I do recommend doing that and researching these sorts of environments, because one of the things that is often discussed in permaculture circles is creating guilds. And a guild is a group of plants that grow really well together in a good habitat. But I think we need to change how we're talking about that. It's not something we create. It's something that already exists. Right, so everything growing here is already a guild. Okay? We're not creating guilds. We're choosing plants that we're most interested in making friends with from within a guild that already exists. And if you go and you study these open environments like we've been touring here across the country, and you look into them, look into the research with them, pick the ones near you that are most appropriate for your climate, go hit up Google Scholar and find the papers. Find what's written about them. Look at the species lists, and then look through those species lists to find the species that you want to make friends with as part of your agroforestry activity or your forest garden or your edible landscape, however you are structuring the work that you're doing on your property. So I hope that this gives you some ideas. Now again, these open environments, don't treat these as universal examples. If you're in a desert, it's foolish to try and make trees grow to the same height and structure that they do here in the East. Likewise, there's better models for you. Work with the desert. Work with all of the beautiful, wonderful, fascinating plants that already grow around you. Likewise, if you're here on the East Coast or in other summer wet forests where you have a closed canopy and so much is growing so quickly that, if you're not mowing weekly, you're going to just have, shrubs and briars pop up all over the place. It's just as silly to try and take that environment and force it to be an open forest or a savanna as it is to try and take a desert and grow maple trees. Okay? It's a different environment, and you can work with the old growth pattern in that setting. And the old growth pattern, as we talked about in the beginning of this video, takes just as good an advantage of daylight and maximizing light capture as a savanna does. But it's better suited to that type of environment than these completely open structures. We will talk about other things in other videos. We'll do a video here sometime about edge effect. We'll do a video about old growth forest patterns and what you can learn from them. That is planned content. It's coming. If you're watching this in the future, it might already be up, and I'll make sure it's in the end screen whenever I do it. So if you're watching this a year or 2 years in the future, maybe that'll already be up. I hope that'll already be up. But know that this is a really wonderful, way to start sinking your teeth into that, guild selection as you design your property. Where would I definitely recommend that you look at these open architectures? Well, one setting would be if you're starting with a cornfield and you're trying to develop a pasture or an orchard. Okay? Look at these. Look at the plants that are growing in these open habitat. Look at your shade-tolerant fruit and nut trees. Look at the food-producing overstory trees where you can add a little bit, have mostly pasture, but a little bit of wooded character and stack functions into that pasture. Okay? Or if you're in any environment which is somewhat drought-stressed, think about these environments and think about the drought-tolerant understory that you can build into an already existing open forest. So I hope this gives you some ideas. Like I said at the beginning, earlier in this video, this is not a prescriptive video, it's an idea generating video. I hope that seeing this can, help you conceptualize what natural open architectures look like and just the wealth of wonderful, beautiful, edible and medicinal plants that grow in these habitats. And if it has, I'd love if you'd subscribe and hit like. It helps the algorithm know to show this to other people. I want to give a big old shout out of thanks and big old thank you to all of the people who helped us with this, friends and family who helped us materially, the wonderful kind folks at the Garden of the Gods who helped us understand where to look for some of the habitats that we found outside of the park because we couldn't film in the park. I'd like to thank my mentor, Will McClatchy, who we stayed with in Oregon, for opening his home to us and helping make that trip possible. As well as all the family and friends and patrons on Patreon who have contributed materially to making this trip and this video possible. If you'd like to join, we'd love to welcome you there, but I just hope that either way you'll come back and join us next time at Old Ways Rising Farm.